this kind of intersectionality of, diversity, equity, inclusion and medicine is something that I think has been long waning. I have been fortunate to have been asked to talk about some of the research we've done, very descriptive data regarding what the demographics of our surgical workforce looks like, particularly in academia. And that's evolved for me. I have now gravitated more towards kind of doubling down on the quality and excellence argument. We've looked at the business model, or we've attempted the business model. We've attempted the pure social justice lens, and I think it will require a combination of them. But really, the quality and excellence one is the one that continues to resonate with most people that I chat with. Basically, saying that you cannot have a truly excellent faculty, you cannot have an excellent health system that provides care equitably without a diverse, inclusive, and equitable workforce that provides that care. And I even talk to our leadership within our health system. I say, if a patient comes into the University of Pennsylvania to have surgery and they're a person of color, and the only people of color that they see that is participating in their care are those that are bringing them their meals or cleaning up behind them in the bathroom or cleaning their linens, the optics of that are wildly inappropriate. They need people that are participating in literally the provision of their medical care in order to know that we value Black minds and brown minds just as much as we value Black and brown bodies. So, if we're going to really be excellent, if we're really going to provide quality care for all of those people that we're charged to care with, then we have to have a workforce, a surgical workforce that's much more reflective of the patient populations in which we treat. Dr. Aarons and I have been making rather significant push within our health system and within the department, thankfully with our leadership's support, particularly of late. And, although we're excited about our match class this year, which is remarkable, we've had a banner year, we still have some room to grow if we're going to be reflective of the patient population that we treat here in the city of Philadelphia, which is predominantly a Black and brown city. So it's a long-winded answer, Dr. Aarons. You and I have given a lot of thought to it and will continue to, but those are kind of my introductory thoughts on it.
Thank you, I appreciate that. Dr. Bradford, I'm going to ask you the same question. Before I get to your answer, I really wanted to pivot a little bit and ask Dr. Roberts and Dr. Nehemiah, who are in medical training. From your perspective, what are the benefits for the learning environment for a surgical trainee to improving diversity and inclusion?
Yeah, I think there's a couple of things. I mean, I think, as was mentioned in the keynote address, it's hard to be what you can't see. And I know that's certainly been true. I've been lucky to be in an environment like Penn where you do have mentors that are of a diverse background, but I could, the numbers show, and in some of Dr. Butler's studies and various studies, that there's likely many trainees out there who do not have a surgeon who looks like them. And that can have an impact on wellness during medical school. We did some qualitative studies that showed that being in a predominantly isolated environment, in a predominantly white environment for African-American students impacts their wellness, a feeling of lack of mentorship. And to be more anecdotal and just kind of my personal experience, kind of just not, feeling like you're not kind of in the club can be a little bit more a sentiment that maybe discourages a brilliant young medical student from pursuing a career in surgery and kind of exacerbates these problems. And then, I agree with everything Dr. Butler just said. I think there's also great data out there showing that there are benefits to patients for having diverse clinicians. We have higher increase in clinical research when there are diverse private investigators. There are higher patient satisfaction scores. There is direct benefit to our patients by having diverse faculty and residents. So I think those would be my thoughts.
I agree with everything Sanford and Dr. Butler said. I think, I kind of share some of those sentiments that Stanford had. I remember, I think Dr. Aarons, you can probably remember when I came to your office initially, because I felt very isolated, and I actually asked if you took a chance on me because, I think surgery in general has been, a predominantly white and male dominated field, and that can be very off-putting and intimidating for somebody. And unfortunately, I think we've probably lost, many brilliant minds just for that reason. They don't feel like they belong. They feel like they're an other. And I think even once you're here, you can very easily feel like an other just because you don't look like or share a lot of the same experiences as your peers. And so I think, diversity and inclusion is very important, not just because of the, life experiences we all have, but there's diversity of thought. People come from different religious backgrounds, creeds. And so those things that you bring to the table just make you so much more well-rounded. And like Dr. Fayanji was saying, having exposure to those different types of people makes you less likely to be biased toward that patient that you see that may fit into those groups or share some of those beliefs, and you can provide more thorough, well-rounded and competent care. So I think that the more diversity you can have, the more excellent you and your program can be.
So I think I can add a few things to both of these comments here. I agree with what everybody has already stated for sure. I know, so for Nth Dimensions, part of our programming really is about the exposure to what we do, about the exposure to physicians of color, but also the exposure to physicians that are allies that may not look like you. Because unfortunately, if there's only, for instance, 1.5% of Black orthopedic surgeons, the chances of you having a Black orthopedic surgery mentor are going to kind of be small. And so part of what we teach our students is to look for allies in other places, he for she, non-UIMs with UIM, so that you can find some commonality. One of the things that Dr. Mason has stated in one of our talks before, who's the Nth Dimensions founder, is that so residents, especially residents of color, you're taught to put your head down, work harder, get your job done. And it really is a very isolating thing to do. But truly, and this is a Dr. Mason quote, isolation is the kryptonite to successful matriculation. And you really have to put yourself out there. You have to find commonality with those that may or may not look like you, so that they can see you as a person, so they can see you as somebody that has something that maybe is in common with them, so that you can find some common ground, because you have to have somebody in that room behind those closed doors that's fighting for you as a resident, that, that maybe, look, I've talked to her. She's not as bad as they say. She's not, she's not as brusque, a verb that, an adjective that I was called in residency. She's not as brusque as they say, right? It's just that she's assertive. She's she's doing her job. She really is passionate about her patients. And so you don't have that commonality with people, that already puts you a little bit behind. And so again, we're taught to put our heads down and just work harder, but that really just perpetuates the isolation and the fact that no one in the program knows you and can fight for you behind those closed doors. So we really encourage our patients to, encourage our students to really find some common ground with those people that may or may not look like them. Because again, those mentors are going to be people that don't look like you. I had the opportunity to listen to a little bit of the keynote before on my way home from the office. I also ran home from the office too. And so, the leaky pathway and the leaky pipeline really is a big problem. These students are being discouraged from elementary school and 3rd and 4th grade, being told that math is not cool or science is not cool. And, and we know that girls start diverging very early on. And so if we can capture some of them that early, catch them at junior high, catch them in the 3rd and 4th grade, expose them to people that look like us, tell them that the work that we do is fun, and being smart isn't a bad thing. that these are all ways that we continue to foster them and grow them in. And certainly programs like Black Men in White Coats and Dimensions, there's so many mentoring programs out there trying to get these kids and encourage them and continue the excellence that we know exists in them that they're being told to suppress, or they're being told it's not something that they can achieve because no one else that they know looks like them has been able to do it. And so I really think that's the importance of our faces out there to be able to show them these things. Obviously, I could talk forever about this. So
we plan to get into it, I promise. And for the record, I would say there was many a conversation where I tried to recruit Ariel to this program. So I would like to say that she took a chance on us, not the other way around. So, we started with the why. So clearly, when we talk about recruiting and diversifying the workforce, there are always going to be these narratives that come up about what are the potential pitfalls of that? Are we lowering the bar? Are we, setting people up for failure? Those kinds of things. So, at every turn we try to impugn those narratives for sure. But what are the barriers? What are the things that we should be working on, both in recruitment as well as in retention?
Part of what, and I'll jump in real quick because I know that we were going to talk about this blog that came out about ACS just recently, but part of the notion that we have to change the programmatic thinking that these spots belong to anybody, right? These spots belong to anybody that is qualified to take this position. They don't always belong to those that are white or those that are male, and therefore we're not lowering any bar if we accept a woman or if we accept a person of color. And that, I think, if we can start off with that premise, this spot doesn't belong to you. It doesn't belong to anybody. It belongs to the qualified person. That then helps to, I think, adjust the thinking that diversity equals something that is less than, which we know in every other arena in business and in quality of care for patients, we know that's not true. So I think that's one issue we have to address, that somehow diversity equals something less than excellent.
I completely agree, Dr. Bradford. Changing that narrative of they took a chance on me or we're taking a chance on that candidate, that's where it starts. That change of lens, the change of mindset. We have proven in our program that despite the fact that we are now more diverse and inclusive, both on the gender and the race ethnicity front, our traditional metrics, our traditional scholastic metrics, step 1 scores, how far we have to go down our rank list, those kinds of things, no statistically significant difference in any of it prior to us starting these initiatives. So yes, you are spot on. The narrative has to change, and it's going to likely have to start at the top with us pushing them along the way.
Yeah. So, when I saw that the blog post that you mentioned with the surgeon who had was finding qualms with the College of American of Surgeons, it reminded me, it reminded me of another blog post recently from the Wall Street Journal from a dean of a medical school who said that medical school is emphasizing social justice topics too much and not emphasizing scholarly activities and scholastic aptitude. And I read that, and I read this article, I had the same reaction, and I thought exactly what Dr. Bradford and Dr. Butler are saying is that that's not actually reality. The data, look at the data. Step 1 scores of medical students has never been higher. And it keeps, it's like this uptrending thing. And, as we look at the diversity in general surgery programs, AppSite scores aren't going down. The metrics by which we, evaluate residents is staying stable. So I think that, we need to step away from this logical fallacy that, diversity and excellence are these exclusive things. And if anything, I think the data points to the opposite, is that you have more unique ideas, teams work better, and you provide better care when your teams are of different backgrounds.
It really does become a perpetuating stereotype too, because these students and residents are felt to believe that they're taking somebody else's spot. that, you know, we didn't want you here, or you're not supposed to be here. And then it almost becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. I mean, imposter syndrome is incredibly real. And, you know, just like you said, you know, did you take a chance on me? We've all felt that. And certainly if you're being told that in the background, how can you not help but think that, well, maybe I'm not supposed to be here. Maybe I'm not as smart as everybody else. So, you know, if we're coming at it from a perspective of, yes, you're supposed to be here. Yes, you're as smart as everybody else. Yes, you belong here. Then that then becomes the self-fulfilling prophecy.
Sure. And I was just going to add, you know, that's the power of language, right? Like that's, you know, all of these biases that we have all stemmed from language. Someone felt or thought, you know, someone else was inferior or whatever. And that gets carried on until it's almost common knowledge, even though it's false. And so, you know, obviously this narrative started somewhere, probably affirmative action. You know, we were lowering our standards to let, you know, diverse people come into these different spaces in our society. And that, you know, that's just been perpetuated over, you know, decades and decades. And here we are. And it's really hard to break that. But if we continue to, you know, perpetuate the language that diversity and excellence are not mutually exclusive and are not opposites, are actually very much related, you know, I think that's where we can start, you know, making some real change.
We actually have a brilliant question in the chat. They were wondering whether it was possible for you to express what it truly means to have diversity, equity, and inclusion in a healthcare system. What does that look like for you?
Simple for me. I mean, a physician workforce that's reflective of the patient population that we're treating. That's it for me. So I don't want to oversimplify it, but that's my dream.
I think also a healthcare system where patients feel empowered to be very much a participant in their own care. You know, they have the resources available to be as health literate as they would like to be. They have that option to participate as much or as little as they want, and they know where, you know, to get their care. Along with, you know, a workforce that reflects the community that it serves, like Dr. Butler said.
I mean, certainly the diversity of faces, brown faces, Black faces, white faces as well, male, female, really makes a difference. So for instance, I'm currently in Gallup, New Mexico, near the Navajo and Zuni reservations. We have Navajo and Zuni doctors. We have Navajo and Zuni nurses. We have Navajo and Zuni, you know, staff, because the culture is different. I am here now as an outsider, really learning about the culture, the things that I can and cannot do, the things that I should and should not do. Without those Navajo and Zuni nurses and physicians, I may not know that. And so that's the importance of the health and equity. It also breeds trust. The patients then feel comfortable. They feel comfortable talking to you about things that maybe they wouldn't be able to talk to you about if you have some knowledge of their culture. And so that really, for me, helps to speak to the importance of the diversity.
Great, thank you. So I think we started to clarify the why and the impacts of a lack of diversity. Let's talk a little bit about the how, right? I think that's what we want to really get to, is how we make a difference. Now, you know, Dr. Roberts was talking about data, right? So the data suggests, as he's recently published, that despite this increased focus, you know, not just this year, but in years prior, you know, there hasn't been any significant change in representation of women or underrepresented minority individuals in surgical education or in positions of leadership. So how do we start to make a difference? And I'm going to start with you, Dr. Bradford, because you've done some work in a space that I think is going to be increasingly important, namely, you know, pathway programs, pipeline programs, and that's something that people always point to as a first step. So, you know, that's a step. Well, you know, what has been your experience in that space?
Yeah. So the how is the $1 million question, right? And if we can figure out the how, then all of us are out of a job, right? Because we've solved the problem. We can all go home, right? Everybody's getting health and equitable care. So I think that, again, the exposure is incredibly important early on, is incredibly important. Orthopedics, as most people know, is one of the least diverse surgical specialties of all. I think we currently have, as I said, 1.5% female, 1.5% Black orthopedic surgeons. But on a positive note, we currently have something like 6% of Black residents, right? And I'm excited and excited for the future because, for instance, this year we matched 17 Black female orthopedic residents when we currently only have 25 in the entire country. So we've almost in 1 year doubled our numbers, and it's not we as in interventions, we as in the entire country, right? So I think the exposure is incredibly important. We do have some data to suggest that if you have an exposure program to you, or you definitely are more likely to apply to that specialty. For orthopedics, for instance, for women, I believe it's 43 times more likely to apply to orthopedics if you've had an exposure program like Enthymensions. The minority number, I think, is 17 times more likely to apply to orthopedics if you've had an exposure type program. So exposure, I think, is incredibly important. We do have to, though, change a little bit of the way that these students are viewed when they come through the residency process, for instance. What does leadership look like? Leadership can't just look like one thing. I think that, what do the universities that the students come from, when they are deemed excellent, moderate or fair, how does that get, calibrated into the equation? We know that HBCUs, for instance, are downgraded, which we also know if you've ever, I didn't attend an HBCU, but if you survived an HBCU, you had to work. And so that breeds grit, that breeds leadership. Black sororities and fraternities don't get the leadership marks that they should get on applications because the majority doesn't really understand what that means and what that leadership entails, the amount of community work and access that entails, right? So you have to a little bit change what leadership and what grit looks like to these people that are picking, right? So if you don't have diversity in the room to adjust what is being picked, then you're going to get the same things over and over and over again, right? So if my boss thinks that grit only is a kid that grew up on a farm in the middle of nowhere, but doesn't somehow connect that working multiple jobs during medical school and still maintaining your grades, or growing up in an urban area where no one is a physician at all, if they don't see that as grit, then we can't ever get those marks on our entrance exams, right? Or on our application screening process. So I think it takes a little bit of us changing that narrative as well, to kind of not necessarily level the playing field. I don't really like that phrase, but to certainly even out the apples and the oranges that are being compared. I think that the awareness that there's an issue, the awareness that we're not thinking about things across the board equally is also an issue. And I think that orthopedics is slowly but surely coming around and beginning to notice some of these things. For our maintenance of certification tests this year, the mandatory article is an article about diversity, which I'm actually incredibly proud that the Academy made that the mandatory article. And it talks about the fact that being aware that we have a problem, evening the playing field, having different metrics for promotion and for being able to recognize excellence in whatever version that looks like, are the ways that we will make changes, changing the top of the leadership so that it's not all white men. Because if you have all white men, they're only going to pick all white men. And so if we can adjust that and change that a little bit, that will then bring that diversity of thought into the room to then beginning to think about grit and leadership in a different kind of way. And so, there's, again, many forms of this. Enthymensions also has an article out recently. We have one in CORE that talks about kind of exposure programs. And then we also have one in AOS now talking about what residencies and leadership can do to make changes. And I'll have somebody put those in the chat as well.
Dr. Butler, I'm going to turn to you. So you're in the GME office, right?
Yeah.
What do programs have to do? What do institutions have to do in a very concrete manner to get the ball rolling?
Yeah, very honestly speaking, I think that we are starting to see some strides made at the UME level. So Black and brown folks getting into medical school, just talking about race. We are seeing an uptick in residency appointments and categorical spots, not just prelim years followed by categorical spots. Where we are stalling is really at the faculty level and then at the senior leadership level. So as an example, when I first started looking at this data in 2008, there were 154 recognized departments of surgery in the country, according to AAMC. There were only 4 female chairs of surgery. Fast forward to 2021, there are now 22 female chairs. When it comes to African American representation, in 2008, there were 13 Black chairs of surgery out of the 154 in the country. As of 2021, it's only 7. And if you take out the 3 HBCUs, that leaves 4. So we are moving in the wrong direction pertaining to Black and brown representation at the highest level. One of my mentors, Dr. Britt, says that the most powerful position in the hospital is a chair of Department of Surgery. And that's debatable. However, there is, that is a position of prominence. That is a position of prominence not only because of the day-to-day job, but also the influence that you can have around you with dean conversations, with other chair conversations, with recruitment and retention of not just medical students and residents, but also faculty, with giving those faculty protected time, with giving them an opportunity to be able to become successful so they can go on to become division chiefs and potentially chairs. So I wish I had an answer for you, Dr. Aarons. I wrestle with this, I struggle with this, I write about this. Honestly, all the conversation that we're having around DEI is very important. It is very good, and it is fruitful. However, the majority, which is rather homogenous right now, has got to be willing to reallocate resources and leadership. That's the reality of it. And until that happens, we are going to continue to stall, particularly when it comes at the leadership level. I think if we can continue to put more into residency and into fellowships, as Dr. Bradford's describing, then inevitably we should have some more faculty appointments. And then inevitably we should have some leadership opportunities, but that's going to be a slow trek. And we've been trying that throughout the decades, but I really think that institutions, health systems, academic medical centers we're going to have to hold their feet to the fire when it comes to these leadership roles.
What role do you see of there being of kind of more transparency in kind of the steps for promotion or compensation? Do you think that's part of the issue here, in that, maybe some of these decisions about leadership are being made kind of in small groups, kind of behind closed doors?
Yeah, Sanford, that's a great question. I don't want to dominate the conversation at all, but I'll quickly chime in. And to Dr. Bradford's point, how do we define excellence? What does excellence look like? Is 75 publications sufficient, or does it have to be 150? These kinds of more nuanced things. Clearly, somebody who's published 75 peer-reviewed manuscripts in a rather abbreviated period of time has probably got the research component down, right? So yeah, I think defining excellence is going to be one thing. I think the accountability at the C-suite level, so our CEOs and our deans looking at how these searches are carried out. I published years ago that the Rooney Rule, the rule that they use in the NFL, should be applied to academic medicine and academic surgery in particular. If you thought some of the comments most recently about DEI efforts are challenging and inflammatory now, you can imagine a decade ago. That being said, it still needed to be discussed. So I think the lens of who else is out there, let's reach a little further, not down, but out, pertaining to candidates that we need to consider, is probably the way that it needs to go, Sanford, in my opinion.
I think there also needs to be some accountability or some, credence put on diversity initiatives, put on the diversity work that you may or may not be doing, or the diversity of your department, or the diversity of something. Because certainly if you've published 75 manuscripts in an abbreviated amount of time, absolutely. But the Rooney Rule, which we know doesn't work very well since there's not that many Black, head coaches, is also that they just have to interview them. They don't have to hire them, and they don't have to actually think about them, on the same level. They have to interview them. And so I think that we're still in the same issue, that if the white man or the white male chair is picking their successor or picking whoever it is, they're still going to gravitate towards the white male, whatever. And so the Rooney Rule, I think, is great, but it needs to go one step further. And I'm sure that that's not going to be incredibly popular out in the world, but it's true, because we know that just interviewing them isn't enough, because they're still not getting picked.
We have one question in the chat here. What do you see as the role of teaching structural racism in healthcare and medical education in the medical curriculum? And how do we incentivize medical schools and residency programs to teach this alongside traditional coursework?
You have to be aware of the problem in order to solve it, honestly. And if you, and the thing is, I think that, a lot of times, especially right now with the cancel culture, we talk a lot about, oh, that person is racist, we have to cancel them, right? But we know that every single one of us have biases, every single one of us. And many of them unconscious, some of them conscious, but many of them unconscious. And so if we're not having a conversation about what these unconscious biases are, then we can't ever overcome them. We can't ever look for them. We can't ever fix them. And if you believe you don't have biases, then you are truly living in a bubble or a vacuum, because we all do. Every single one of us have biases against something. And so I think if we can teach it to be aware of what it is and why it's there, so we can look out for it, then I think that's an initial first step.
Curious to think what some of the trainees think. How is incorporating this sort of framework into your education now important for your trajectory, your role as leaders in surgery, your development?
I know part of you are probably thinking, oh my God, it's just one more thing.
No, I think I've talked to Dr. Butler and Dr. Aarons about this probably since I've been here, about developing some sort of, diversity curriculum. Because I say this all the time, and I think it's true with life in general. You don't know what you don't know, right? And until someone kind of shines the light on it, you may never know. And I think, now more than ever is a time for us to get very comfortable with being uncomfortable. And so I think it's really important, to have these conversations. I've had conversations with colleagues about things that have, been said. And like I said, the power of language, it also, a lot of it starts there. Anecdotally, one of the things that I know people kind of throw around is, it's voodoo, right? But, voodoo is a practice religion practiced by people who look like us, quite frankly. And at some point that was demonized. And now it's, translated to meaning like it's made up, or it's some arbitrary thing that has it's not rooted in anything legitimate, and it's just thrown around. And so people will say it and not even know that it's really offensive, because it, has lost, its meaning to a lot of people. And so, I've had conversations with people about it. I was like, I've been guilty of saying it, and I didn't even recognize it initially. And I was like, wait, this is very offensive. This is something that I've, fallen into accidentally. And it wasn't very comfortable, because I know, when I've had microaggressions against me and things like that, how it's made me feel. But if we can continue to have these conversations and set up a structure within programs to facilitate this and make it more comfortable for people to be honest with each other and hold each other accountable. I think that's where, you know, you'll really see the growth, and you'll graduate trainees who are very competent clinicians with any kind of patient population.
Yeah, and you know, having been somebody who just finished my undergraduate medical education and is still undergoing, you know, my residency training, I feel like, you know, the formal education was very light on these topics. You know, maybe a lecture here or there. You know, Ariel's comment that she's trying to develop this curriculum now just shows you that, you know, at least from my experience, there was not a lot of this being taught formally. And I think even in the research domain, you know, many of us here were publishing on these topics, you know, before last summer, but I felt like the attitude towards many of these topics kind of shifted, in that it went from being this, oh, they're, they're just complaining about these different things, to being granted a different sense of legitimacy. And it's really unfortunate that it kind of takes this sort of tragedies and social unrest to kind of bring these to the public eye. But you know, I think previously it maybe wasn't given the credence that it should have been.
Yeah, definitely people doing DE&I work, you know, Nth Dimensions has been here for 17, 18 years, and we have absolutely become the popular kid at the party this past year. You know, before we certainly had people that were interested and we had allies, but I think we've doubled the amount of interest in the last year, which is a good thing. But I agree with you that it shouldn't take such a tragedy for that to happen. The other thing is we really have to make these conversations that are incredibly difficult easier to have. We can't always, you know, jump on this cancel culture thing if somebody makes a mistake. If we need to be open to having honest conversations about the mistake, about, hey, that's voodoo. Well, this is what it really means. This is why you shouldn't use it. And make it doesn't necessarily have, these aren't easy topics, right? But you've got to be able to have the discussions, hopefully with somebody that's open and interested in learning. And if we make it such that it's always an adversarial thing when this happens, then they're going to stop talking to us. They're going to stop having these conversations at all. So we have to, not a safe space per se, but we definitely have to make it easier to even have the conversations to educate and hopefully bring people further along.
Thank you. You know, something I think about a lot as I started doing more of this work is, you know, the emphasis, as we've clearly been talking about tonight, is on ethnic diversity, but certainly I think we mean diversity in the broadest sense to include cognitive diversity. But we tend to be focused on the numbers, right? So alongside every, you know, diversity effort should be a parallel structure for mentorship and support, right? So I just wonder if some of the panelists could speak about, you know, how do we go about engendering this cross-cultural sort of mentorship that we've been sort of alluding to? How do we develop infrastructure within our programs in our institutions to make sure that trainees, faculty, everyone else feels supported, including patients, obviously?
I think you can do this at a lot of different levels, and I think it's important to. I think just kind of the lowest hanging fruit is just having an explicit programmatic goal of being a diverse and inclusive environment, and that should really come from the very senior leadership. And I say that, you know, and make that public. And then surgery presents an interesting environment in that there's what's being, you know, said kind of at grand rounds or, you know, on Twitter. But that needs to be reflected in smaller group environments, in the operating room, when it's kind of you know, people feel more protected and they speak their mind more freely. So I think surgery as a field in particular needs to kind of reflect that in both scenarios. And then I think, you know, having programs like AMP, you know, having communities around you kind of helps with those feelings of isolation that we talked about earlier that kind of lead to increased burnout and you know, probably lower rates of retention. So, you know, again, you can't depend on just the Department of Surgery because, you know, the numbers are probably not there and will take a little while to get there. But having these broader community groups of all graduate medical education I think can go a long way as to, fostering community.
I think intentionality is going to be really important. Dr. Aarons, I think as more and more departments have an understanding of the level of importance on this issue of mentorship, and even more importantly, in my opinion, sponsorship, particularly as people are starting to move along the totem pole, I think people just need to be thoughtful about it. It can't be a flash in the pan. It can't be a conversation we're having now and then. Don't reassess until a year later. It's something that probably needs to be reassessed on a quarterly basis. You and I are taking a lot of pride in bringing a lot of Black and brown surgeons into our health system, but we also know, and as Dr. Sanford and Dr. Nehemiah published on, you have to support them when we get them there, right? So that is equally important in our recruitment efforts is our retention efforts. And along that is the mentorship and sponsorship. Also want to say, and this kind of reiterates what Dr. Bradford said, and Dr. Fyanju's comments about mentorship and mirroring is incredibly important, right? You want to see someone that looks like you in order to ensure or help reassure yourself that you are in the right place and you have the aptitude and capacity to achieve what your goal is. But I heard Wayne Frederick gave grand rounds at our institution about a month and a half ago, and a really, really nice statement about along his journey, and it's similar for me, most of his mentors did not look like him. And he said that that's likely going to be the reality for most Black and brown learners that are residence fellows and then junior faculty. So they don't necessarily have to look like you, they just have to share your mission, right? And if we have that mantra that we share with our entire department, because even our department has a certain demographic that is not overly heterogeneous, but if everybody buys into the fact that these young learners are going to be looking for mentors, that's also going to be powerful in both directions, right? Mentees looking for mentors, and then potential faculty looking for more mentees.
So that's true. I think you're exactly right. But mission statements are great, but how do we put this into action? Is it peer mentoring? Is it faculty development programs? How do we engender this concept of everyone rowing in the same direction? We sort of lift as we climb.
Yes, and yes, and yes. All of the above. The other thing, again, we talk about leadership and reaching back and really kind of walking the walk, not just talking it, but walking the walk, right? And so it's going to be important, especially on the programmatic level, that these program directors are having check-ins with these residents, and not just the residents of color, every single resident. Because if you're only meeting with the residents of color, then you are now kind of isolating them out. You are separating them from everybody else. And you should be having really very honest and open conversations with all of your residents on a regular scheduled basis. So maybe it's not monthly because maybe that's unrealistic, but maybe it's quarterly. You have a quarterly meeting with all of the residents, and in between that quarterly meetings, maybe you're meeting individually, you have that open door policy, but you certainly have to be reflective of what you want from the leadership down, and that does start with the program director and the chair. And so they have to buy into this in order for there to really be a change.
There's a
perfect segue to one of the questions in the chat, which is, how do you think DEI efforts like mentorship should be evaluated in faculty promotion to improve the diversity of faculty and leadership positions? And I'm curious selfishly because I'm someone who does a lot of work in this space, so I'm trying to figure it out.
I mean, I think this kind of gets at the concept of kind of the minority tax, where, as minority physicians, and, I can at least speak personally, I feel a sense of responsibility of, being one of very few that looks like us in these positions of privilege and influence. And, will these efforts be valued, as you progress? And my hope is that they will be more and more so, as I think both the country and hopefully medicine starts to kind of accept these as issues affecting patients, both from a clinical aspect and from a a personal one. But yeah, I think that's a very pressing issue.
It speaks to a little bit of what I was talking about before about promotion and including some of these diversity initiatives, some of this diversity work that you're doing into your calculator for promotion, into your calculator for, assistant or associate professorship. Like if those things aren't counted as a metric, then you don't ever get the points for the work that you're doing, probably a lot of after hour work, a lot of weekend work, a lot of extra work that's outside of you being in the operating room as you as a surgeon. And so if we don't take into account that those things are important, then again, that's also that reflective of leadership, not valuing what they're saying, right? You have a mission statement that looks fabulous, but if you don't actually walk that walk and bring that mission statement to fruition, and count some of this diversity work that your faculty members are doing, then you're not actually valuing what you're saying. It's going to be a shift. It's going to be a big shift in thought for sure, but it's possible.
Well, I also think, just to interject, that as we have more and more like these roles, vice chairs of diversity, equity, and inclusion, and things like that are sitting at the table with some of our senior leaders regarding promotion and co-op committees and what have you, is that these voices are, well, this lens prayerfully is now being articulated in these closed door meetings. So, honoring and respecting DEI efforts like any other scholastic work is where we need to go. And I think we now have an increased number of people potentially at the table that can hopefully show some light. Still going to require documentation. And I tell my mentees all the time, if you are mentoring medical students, you need to document that. You need to keep a record of who you are speaking with, not because, so one, the expectation is that they pay it forward, right? However, for you to continue to excel and to achieve, these kinds of things are going to be of value. That way, when you go to apply, or if you become a junior faculty member and now you have a lot more mentees, then you can easily point to this list of people that you've been working with. And prayerfully, we have a committee that will also consider it and honor it in such a way. But I think more people at the leadership level, when it comes to promotion, is probably the key, Dr. Aarons.
Yeah, so I have one more question, which I want each of the panelists to answer, which is something I've been thinking about increasingly now is, we talked about representation. I think we all hopefully would admit that's important. And we're seeing increasing amounts of emphasis on representation and increasing amounts of initiatives around DEI. So my sort of final question is, how do programs and institutions go about measuring the impact of all of this work? You talked about a little bit, Dr. Butler, about quarterly assessments, because we work in a very data-driven specialty. How do we go about measuring the impact of this work on the culture of a program or an institution, or as a specialty altogether? I'll start with Dr. Roberts.
I think that's an excellent question. And I was actually just thinking about this topic more from the lens of research, but even as the country becomes more multiracial, as there's, biracial, and just how are we going to continue studying these topics and kind of delineating differences between groups? But I think, the easiest thing that we've kind of touched on several times here is looking just at the diverse, the number of diverse people that you have in a department, the retention of those people. But how do you kind of tabulate a culture shift? I think that's something a little bit trickier to do. I think, as we mentioned in the keynote, that study methods like qualitative research can be helpful in that regard. More informally, just from a programmatic standpoint, just checking in kind of with residents and such, I think is important.
Yeah, I think a lot of the same things as Dr. Roberts said. I think probably quality metrics will kind of really allow you to know just how effective your efforts have been, because you can increase the numbers, sure, but if people are burnt out, people aren't happy, people have feelings of isolation, have you really made things better? I mean, on paper, sure, but I think, you know, we're all striving for programs that obviously reflect the population that they serve, and are full of physicians who, you know, are well and, you know, can provide, you know, the best care possible for their patients all the time. And, you know, their patients are also, you know, doing well, and these disparities are being narrowed, if not eliminated. And so I think, you know, the check-ins, like Sanford said, and you know, from the top down, because obviously we know the numbers dwindle as you get higher up, and so the feelings of isolation are probably even more glaring, is kind of the way to really get an idea if your efforts are really causing the shift that you want them to create. I don't think numbers alone, while they're a good place to start, I don't think just like sheer numbers alone will give you the answer that we all want and are striving for. And I think you could, you know, trickle those quality measures down to patients too. How do they view their care? How do they view their, you know, their state of health? What's their, you know, their overall access? Have we closed those gaps at all with these efforts? Do they feel like their care is comprehensive and sound? Do they trust us? Those are different things that you can look into to see if, you know, we really are improving the culture and program as a whole.
Do you want to take it next, Dr. Bradford?
I'll follow you.
No, it's fine. So as Dr. Roberts and Dr. Nehemiah mentioned, I would say, I mean, you can count bodies, right? We're getting pretty good at that, right? The AAMC, they tabulate that information for us, and we've been looking at that very closely. So you can look at your retention efforts, you can look at your recruitment efforts. You know, beyond that, I would say you look at programming, right? You could look at, so have we incorporated a diverse group of individuals into our visiting professorships? Have we incorporated a certain number of articles into our journal clubs that come from diverse, you know, authors from diverse backgrounds? I wrestle with this a fair amount. You know, the question that keeps coming into my mind is, like, how do you measure the dimensions of a changed heart? And that's what we're after, right? We want a changed perspective, a changed heart as to where we're going in academic medicine, academic surgery. And you know, I don't have the answer. I think obviously, hopefully we know it when we're there. That's what I'm hoping and praying for. I would say that, you know, 360-degree assessment evaluation, as Ariel kindly mentioned, where you assess faculty, you assess learners, you assess patients to see if you've been able to make an impact on the culture and climate of the health system. So we don't know, but I'm confident that we will know it once we've kind of tipped the balance.
Maybe I should have gone before that. That was a fantastic answer. So, you know, obviously the easiest measure is how many residents are we producing, right? How many residents of color are we producing? And I feel like I'm going to lead us right into another question. But if the measure is how many residents of color are you training and you check off those boxes, awesome, right? But that's not the goal. The goal is how many residents are you graduating? How many residents are becoming board certified whatevers, right? The goal is not to get you into residency. The goal is to get you out of residency. And so we certainly, and unfortunately, again, the surgery numbers are terrible at this, especially in orthopedics. I know that Christina sent out that terrible graph from the ACGME regarding the number of residents of color that are dismissed, which is way disproportionate and much higher than those that we even have in the specialty, right? So the goal is not just to get you in, the goal is to get you out. And how do we support you through residency to get you out? Not just in a programmatic level, but really overall, ACGME level, AAMC level, every surgeon attending of color level. Like, we have to be supportive to ensure that these residents are graduating, so that we're helping to produce that diversity within the fields of medicine that can go out and then touch these patients and change it from that perspective. And if you've only got 6% residents of color, but 40% of the residents are being dismissed in any given year that are of color, then those are terrible numbers. And we absolutely have to address the support of our residents during residency so that they graduate.
All right, I think that was a fantastic session. I really want to thank all of the panelists for their comments and perspectives. I will close by saying that, like Dr. Butler said, I think if the future is bright, and I'm optimistic. And certainly I can look at my computer screen and I can tell you that I'm a proud program director to these two phenomenal residents. So I'm increasingly optimistic every day. And for the people on the call who may not recognize this session, this conference was put together by a group of motivated medical students from a variety of backgrounds and perspectives. So I think that is also a moment for optimism for our specialty, that we have such bright young minds who are coming together to talk about such an important topic. So my thanks and applause to Christina and her group for putting this together, and certainly for everyone who gave us their attention tonight. I really appreciate it. Thank you.